Fright Lore Episode 3, Am I Beautiful? This Japanese urban legend about a possibly spectral female with a mutilated face and a propensity for stalking people and killing them after cutting their mouths to resemble a macabre smile is said by most folklorists to have reached the peak of its popularity in the mid-1970s. During this time, a stream of sightings of the being in question were reported to the police in major cities like Tokyo. The resulting mass hysteria that ensued could be compared to the American satanic panic of the 1980s. Fuel was only added to the fire when real-life women bearing such scars and facial deformities were accused of the alleged crimes, most of which didn't have any hard evidence to back up the claims. It was not uncommon during that period to see children walking home from school in large groups or being accompanied by an adult, for fear of the crazed individual attacking the children and cutting their faces in order to resemble her own. Though this story is usually categorized under more contemporary urban mythology, being filed away with classic campfire story characters like the Hooked Man, the Killer in the Back Seat, or the Phantom Hitchhiker, there is evidence to suggest that this particular legend outdates them all. Folklorist Matthew Meyer has pointed to similar folktales from the Edo period as possible inspiration, placing the story's origin anywhere between 1700 and 1900. The theory makes quite a bit of sense, being that beauty was considered a precious commodity to noble women of this time. In a society where women couldn't own property, and their social status was determined by their potential husband's level of wealth and influence, marrying well was the ultimate goal in life, and what these women spent the entirety of their young lives training for. The thought of a sudden illness or accident that would result in the loss of beauty and the chances of getting married was truly a nightmare scenario. A story that focuses on the loss of beauty and subsequent social consequences that would incur would be a narrative that resonated with high-born women of that period. Now that you're aware of some of the cultural and historical background, let's get to our story. This retelling bears the core elements of the story, however some parts have been edited or added to for the sake of briefness and clarity. Am I Beautiful, or Kuchisaki Onna, edited and retold by Arthur Short. There once was a samurai who had an estate perched high on a cliff, overlooking the sea. His home was filled with all the most beautiful things money could buy: tapestries, hand-painted china, jade statues, and paper lanterns that illuminated the cherry trees in his courtyard at night. He had a private garden filled with rare, colorful flowers, and many ponds and fountains stocked with graceful koi fish. The walls were made of thin rice paper, letting the sound of the nightingale drift into the halls at night, carried by a breeze laced with the scent of cherry blossoms. He had been high-born and very fortunate in life, but was still unsatisfied. Though he collected the most beautiful things in the world, the pleasures that they gave him were short-lived and fleeting. The lifelike statues in his garden stared back at him with cold, uncaring eyes. The portraits on his walls hung there in perpetual silence, unaware of his presence and never looking happy to see him. His only company were his servants, who knew of his terrible temper and only spoke when spoken to. One day the samurai was riding through the village that sat at the bottom of the valley, in the shadow of his grand estate. While there, he saw a girl working in the fields. She was clothed in rags and had on a duan that hid her pale face from the sun. Her long black hair hung down her back in a tight braid. When she lifted her head to look at the passing samurai, he saw how pale and smooth her skin was, like marble. Her eyes were the deepest black, like onyx, and for a brief moment her scarlet lips curved into a smile. The samurai decided that very moment that this exceptionally beautiful young lady was what was missing from his otherwise perfect existence. All other works of art in his vast collection were meaningless if he could not possess this girl. That evening, he arrived at the simple one-story cottage where the girl's parents lived, for they were his tenants, and offered a hefty sum in exchange that they give her to him as his bride. The parents readily agreed to the arrangement, assuring their frightened daughter that this would mean a much better life for her. A carriage was sent and the humble farm girl arrived at her fiancé's estate. There she was bathed, made up, dressed in the finest silk kimono, and for all intents and purposes was made to look like a queen. Pearls were woven into her dark hair, golden bangles with small bells put on her wrists, and her face was powdered a ghostly white. She looked more beautiful than ever, like one of the samurai's paintings come to life. They were married soon afterward, and for a time it seemed like all of her problems were now over. She would never need to labor in the fields again, her family had enough money to live comfortably, and the fact that she did not love her new husband made little difference. After the first few months, the samurai was called away on business, leaving his young wife alone at the estate. Because of his jealousy and paranoia, she was forbidden to leave the estate while he was away. She would walk in the garden for many hours during this time, watching the swallows fly over the walls and away from the grand house that had now become her gilded prison. It wasn't long before she met a young guard who was left to watch the front gates of the house, and the two began an affair. Her husband was away so often and for such periods of time that it wasn't difficult for them to keep the relationship a secret. The house itself was the size of a small town, full of many hidden rooms and secluded gardens where they could meet in secret. The samurai, however, seeing that his wife appeared less gloomy and subdued, began to suspect something was amiss, and listened to her conversation through the thin paper walls. He heard her making plans with her lover to run away, taking the opportunity to sneak away when he left on his next business trip. The samurai was enraged, but instead of confronting her directly, he came up with a more devious revenge. He waited till the day he was set to leave, and let the pair think he had gone. That night, the samurai's wife made her way to the courtyard, wearing a cloak and taking with her only the essentials needed for the journey. When she arrived in the courtyard, she cried out in horror at what she saw. Standing in the courtyard at the front gate was her husband. Lying at his feet, bathed in the yellow light of the paper lanterns, was her lover. He was lying in a pool of red, his body cut in half at the waist. She sobbed and wailed as she fell to her knees among the gore, his blood staining her delicate white nightgown. Before she could stop him, her husband grabbed her by the face.
What's wrong, Matthew?
He said mockingly.
Why do you ruin your pretty face with such an expression?
He withdrew his sword, still soaked in the young guard's blood, and held it to her face.
Why will you not smile for me?
He then slashed her face from ear to ear, carving a permanent smile onto her once perfect face.
That's better.
He said as she fell to the ground, moaning in agony.
Now who will call you beautiful?
He walked away, leaving her as she clutched the guard's mangled body, her blood mingling with his. The next morning, the guard's body was tossed off of the cliff without ceremony, where it crashed into the rocks below and disappeared into the violent foam. The samurai's wife was spared, but spent the rest of her days in solitude. She wore a porcelain mask to cover her ruined face, a lifeless, imperfect copy of the woman she had once been. She wandered the garden at night as not to frighten the servants, the lamplight shining off of her porcelain face. Soon, however, as the months of pain and isolation wore away at her sanity, she found she couldn't take it anymore. She threw herself off the cliff so that she might join her lover below, her delicate kimono spreading out like wings as she descended into the churning waters. The samurai did not mourn his wife long, being all too happy to rid himself of damaged goods. His estate fell quiet, though, his footsteps echoing down the long, empty halls. No birds sang in the garden anymore, the petals of the cherry trees falling silently to the empty courtyard. The house began to feel uncomfortable, hostile even. A shadow had fallen over the grand estate. Everyone could feel it, from the servants to the master of the house himself. The samurai tried to ignore the gloom that had invaded his once perfect sanctuary, tried to distract himself with gambling and drink and banquets. Soon, however, his friends stopped coming to the house, it no longer feeling suitable as a place for merrymaking and diversion, every happy feeling being quickly snuffed out the moment one entered those gates. In time, the samurai was just as alone as his late wife had been, following her footsteps as he wandered the maze-like gardens in the oppressive silence. It was this very reason that he doubted his senses when he first heard the voice. It came to him one still afternoon.
Am I beautiful?
It asked. He looked around in surprise, but just as he expected, he was alone in the garden. It was only the babbling of the fountain, he assured himself. When the voice came the next day, repeating its question,
Am I beautiful?
he took comfort in that it was just the bird song, though inside he knew that the birds had left weeks before. When he heard the voice whisper in the hall in the dead of night,
Am I beautiful?
he laid still in his darkened room, trying not to look at the door. He told no one of his private torment, though then again there was no one for him to tell. When he walked the same garden path every day, from out of the corner of his eye he could see a figure dressed in brightly colored silk. He heard the faint tinkling sound of gold bangles as the figure walked beside him, followed by the same question he knew it would ask.
Am I beautiful?
It mattered not how fast he walked or what part of the house he resided, the figure was ever present. always in the corner of his eye, but never in direct line of sight. He stayed awake for many days as the figure repeated the question over and over during the night. Through the paper wall, he could see the outline of a woman, dressed in a flowing kimono, standing beside his bedroom. He heard the tinkling of her bangles as she glided back and forth down the hall. Even after he tore down the wall with his hands in a fit of rage, he saw nothing but empty halls. That didn't stop the voice from calling to him from the same spot. The samurai began to waste away, refusing food or sleep, hearing the same question repeated over and over again in his mind.
Am I beautiful?
When the time came that his sanity had finally left him, all desire to live having been drained away, he walked out of his room towards the courtyard, still wearing his night clothes. He stepped out of the room into the garden, which was bathed in the flickering light of the lanterns. The moon hung high above the gate, and bathed in its silvery glow was a figure. She wore a long kimono, which fluttered in the breeze like a mist. Her porcelain mask shone brightly in the light of the moon, though in her dark eyes there was no light to be found. In her hand was his sword, which he had polished till it shone like a mirror. He approached the woman with labored footsteps, breathing heavily under the strain. She cocked her head to one side, her long hair streaming down in front of her face.
Am I beautiful?
She asked.
Yes.
He said in a rasping voice. She paused and lifted her hand to her face. She removed the mask, letting it fall among the folds of her gown. She looked up at him and grinned, all of her teeth visible through her slashed face. Her mouth was rimmed with red, caked on blood and pieces of hair sticking to it.
Am I beautiful now?
She asked. The samurai let out a blood-curdling scream as she raised his prized sword to his face. With one quick motion, she slashed him ear to ear, carving on a smile that he would wear from that moment on. When he fell to the ground in pain, she disemboweled him, laying his pieces the same way he had done to her lover. You would think that that would be the end of this story, but unfortunately not. The samurai's wife could never find rest. She wanders the night to this very day. You could have seen her in a crowded street corner, or out of the corner of your eye. Her clothes and appearance change depending on the time. Now most people say her kimono has been replaced with a long trench coat, her surgical mask taking the place of her porcelain one. She still looks for people to ask her question to. If you answer yes, she'll carve your face with a pair of scissors so you can look like her. And if you say no, she'll saw you in half. Not to fear though, because if you tell her that you have a previous appointment, she'll leave you alone. Better hope you remember what to say when she takes off her mask